good evening everyone. I'm Gillian Smith and I'm the Chief Medical Officer of Royal Free London, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening to the Marsden Lecture, which is an event that speaks to the enduring legacy of one man's commitment and determination to transform healthcare for Londoners. Firstly, I'd like to extend my gratitude to the Royal Free Charity for hosting this event on behalf of the Royal Free London. The Marsden Lecture honours our founder, Dr. William Marsden, and his remarkable vision changed the course of medical history. Nearly 200 years ago, Marsden encountered a woman in the streets close to death and unable to pay to receive hospital care. He was deeply moved by this injustice, and he acted. He founded a hospital, the Royal Free Hospital, where care would be based on need, not wealth. And his vision really foreshadowed the founding principle of our NHS. And that commitment to accessible healthcare for everyone is one that we continue to cherish very much here today at Royal Free London. This evening we're gathered here in the atrium. It's a space that we use to welcome new colleagues when we do their induction, when they start working at the Trust. And it's also where we celebrate and hold wellbeing events. It's also where we host our annual members meeting, which is a symbol of our accountability to our community, to our staff and to our patients. And so it's really fitting, such an integral part of the Trust's life, that we're really at the heart of one of our hospitals, and we're going to be able to join the dots between the vision of our founder and the role of philanthropy in supporting today's NHS and indeed the NHS we want and need to have in the future. In just a moment, you'll hear from Judy De Winter, the chair of the Royal Free Charity, who will introduce our guest speaker. But before I hand over, I'd like to extend a really special welcome to some of our former Royal Free London colleagues. And we're really delighted to have you here this evening. Professor Stephen Powis joins us, who is NHS England's National Medical Director. We also welcome Caroline Clark, Regional Director of the NHS in London. Dr. Chris Strether, Medical Director for the NHS in London. Sir David Sloman, who as Regional Director led the COVID response in the NHS in London before taking up the role of Chief Operating Officer at NHS England. And finally, Dominic Dodd, our previous Royal Free London Chair. It's really lovely to see you all here this evening, and thank you very much for your continued support. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Judy De Winter, Chair of the Royal Free Charity.
Good evening, everyone. As you heard, I'm Judy De Winter, Chair of the Royal Free Charity, and I would also like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you here this evening. We're delighted to be hosting this event on behalf of the Royal Free London. So the Marsden Lecture is a prestigious annual lecture that's delivered by a leading authority in the world of healthcare, research or academia. It's the lead up to the 200th anniversary of the Royal Free Hospital being established, and we're celebrating the legacy of the hospital's founder, William Marsden. His legacy serves as a reminder of the profound impact that one person's vision and dedication can have on the course of history. And his story pays testament to the impact of philanthropy to which the Royal Free Hospital owes its existence. I'd like to take a brief moment to tell you what the Royal Free Charity stands for. We exist for the benefit of the Royal Free London, whether that's supporting NHS staff with wellbeing programmes or helping improve outcomes for patients by speeding up diagnoses and funding research. We stand shoulder to shoulder with the Royal Free London. A very tangible example is the charity's recent acquisition earlier this year of one of the world's most advanced PET-CT scanners, which is the first to be used in the UK. This scanner uses much lower doses of radiation while scanning faster and producing much better quality images. By securing funding that would otherwise not be available, the Royal Free Charity is directly enabling an increase in cancer diagnostic capacity and speed. And of course, everything we do is made possible thanks to our supporters. Many of you here this evening have supported us through your time, donations and advocacy, and we are deeply grateful. It's your support that allows us and the Royal Free London to push the boundaries of clinical care and research further and faster than could happen with NHS funding alone. So philanthropy is an integral part of that relationship, and I'm delighted that this evening gives us an opportunity to delve a bit deeper into that connection. So on that note, it's now my great honour to introduce our guest speaker. As Chief Executive of the Wolfson Foundation, he leads one of the UK's most philanthropic and impactful organisations, funding excellence in research and education. His leadership has seen the Foundation play a pivotal role in contributing to the health, resilience and sustainability of our society. His commitment to philanthropy extends beyond the UK. He has a strong interest in international development and helped found and is chair of the Savannah Education Trust, which works to provide education opportunities for children in West Africa. He also serves on the board of Mercy Ships, a charity using modern hospital ships to bring world-class volunteer medical professionals directly to the places needed most. In recognition of his work, in 2020, he was awarded an OBE for services to charity. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Paul Ramsbottom.
Thank you, Judy. Well, thank you very much, Judy, for that warm and generous welcome. And it's a great delight to be with you this evening, not least because I very much admire the work of the Royal Free Charity and admire your leadership, John, and your leadership, Judy. Well, the subject tonight is philanthropy. And so it's particularly appropriate that it's a lecture in the name of William Marsden, given what an inspirational figure he was and remains. And I'll return to William Marsden and I'll return to the Royal Free. But by way of introduction to this topic of healthcare and philanthropy, let me say two things. First, there could be no more important time to be talking about philanthropy and no more important time to be talking about healthcare. Philanthropy is more crucial than ever. And the world of health is a very interesting case study to test what philanthropy is and indeed where the boundary might reasonably fall between state provision and what the charitable sector and philanthropy might provide. But secondly, there is a paradox that is emerging in modern UK and also on the other side of the Atlantic in the US. Philanthropy is needed more than ever. But at the same time, the very concept of philanthropy is being questioned and challenged. So these are the two big themes that I'd like us to consider tonight. Now, philanthropy can be defined in a number of different ways. This evening, I'm going to define it loosely as the use of private assets, private wealth, for the good of public, for the good of society. And the word has, rightly or wrongly in recent years, tended to associate itself with major giving by major donors of one sort or another. And so, if only to constrain the breadth of tonight's lecture, I'll limit myself to that area. Well, in that context, and perhaps this analogy works reasonably well in a medical audience, philanthropy's been likened to the body, the corpse, at a family funeral. It's essential for the body to be there, but you don't expect it to speak. And philanthropy, although central clearly to the charitable sector, relatively rarely has a voice. So I'm glad to be speaking from the vantage point, as you heard, as Chief Executive of the Wolfson Foundation, a funder across research and education. And so while speaking generally on some of these trends and themes, I'll to a considerable extent draw on the Wolfson Foundation as a case study. But by way of introduction, we start in the winter of 1827. And we start here on the steps of St Andrew's Church, and we start with a young surgeon, William Marsden, and perhaps the defining moment of Marsden's life, finding a young woman on those steps, malnourished and ridden with disease, to use the language of the time. In vain he tries to find her a hospital bed, but she dies 2 days later. Haunted by this, Marsden opened a free dispensary at Holborn Hill, not far from the church, and later a hospital, the gloriously named London General Institution for the Gratuitous Care of Malignant Diseases, which of course was pithily shortened to the London Free Hospital, forerunner to this great institution that we all know and love, the Royal Free. So it's one of the great stories of 19th century philanthropy. And here he is, and I think the scene just behind his head is that iconic scene of him with a young woman. A moment of crisis, a moment of heartache experienced by Marsden that sparked a desire to change society, backed and supported by wealthy friends in London and beyond. Well, if we fast forward just over a century, the creation of the National Health Service in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War created, of course, a new paradigm for the health service, but it also created a new paradigm for philanthropy itself. And it would, of course, be a mistake to assume that this ended the need for health charity. So as we move to that post-war period, let us also move to an individual who, for me, a bit like William Marsden, is an inspirational figure in terms of philanthropy, Isaac Wolfson. Isaac Wolfson was born exactly 3 decades after William Marsden died. So 3 decades after William Marsden died, Isaac Wolfson was born. And the organisation that I have the privilege to work for, the Wolfson Foundation, was established by him in 1955. And his story, in many ways, is a classic rags to riches story. His family fled persecution and pogroms in Eastern Europe, came to Victorian Glasgow in the 1890s, and from there he built a large fortune through the retail trade and through great universal stores in particular. And having built that fortune, he set up the Wolfson Foundation to give back to the society that had given his family refuge and that had given his family opportunity. And it's good to have his granddaughter, Laura Wolfson Townsley, who's also a permanent trustee of the Wolfson Foundation, here tonight. So among the wide-ranging aims that were set down in 1955 when the Wolfson Foundation was established, the documents set out a particular interest in health education and medical research. There was, as we've just seen for William Marsden, an iconic single moment that sparked him into action. For Isaac Wolfson, there doesn't seem to have been that sole transformatory moment. But there was a similar backdrop. The streets of Glasgow in the first half of the 20th century. And the founding documents of the Wolfson Foundation make very clear that a key early focus was medical research and medical education because of that backdrop, and particularly the scourge of TB in Glasgow. It remained, as many of you will know, right through till the 1950s, the TB capital of Europe, with significantly higher incidence than other UK cities. And Isaac Wolfson found, as no doubt William Marsden had found before, that looking at health issues can never be done in isolation. In terms of TB in Glasgow, or in terms of the young woman on the steps of St Andrews, there is and was a complex relationship between poverty, such as the poor housing and sanitation shown on this slide, and ill health. Well, Marsden went on to have an extraordinarily distinguished career, and two of London's finest hospitals, the Royal Free and the Royal Marsden, in large part bear his print as founder and fundraiser. And in many ways, Isaac Wolfson's legacy is similarly impressive. Since its creation, the foundation has supported about 15,000 projects with over 2 billion committed in funding in real terms. Many of those have had a focus on healthcare and medicine, and of course, not least on our doorstep here at the Royal Free. We had quite a lot of fun digging this photo out of the archives. It is a picture of Wolfson trustee Sir Cyril Clarke, who was also president of the Royal College of Physicians, opening the new renal laboratories here on this site 44 years ago. Well, enough of the introduction, but let us keep these two figures, William Marsden and Isaac Wolfson, in mind as we turn to some of the wider trends. A recent report suggested that a quarter of all charitable grants internationally are made in the area of healthcare and medicine. And certainly on both sides of the Atlantic, the largest foundation is committed to this area. In the States, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and of course here in the UK, in London, the Wellcome Trust. This then is a critically important subject. But as a subject, it speaks to a couple of important questions that face philanthropy generally, questions that have resonance across the charitable sector and across all modern societies. So first then, this balance between state funding and philanthropy in the changing dynamic between what government can and will do and what comes from charitable giving. How can we get that balance right? And secondly, the current levels of scrutiny on philanthropy and this uncomfortable paradox that just at the moment philanthropy is needed as much as ever, it's also questioned more than ever. So let's turn to the first question, the proper responsibility of government, where civil society might start, where statutory responsibility might end. What are the drawbacks when even civil society action, such as the independent hospice, becomes very heavily dependent on government funding? And I thought it might be helpful, rather than tackling the subject completely in the abstract, to talk about one funder's approach to philanthropy, one funder's approach to healthcare in the current era. And so while touching on other examples, I'll draw on the Wolfson Foundation, not, I hasten to add, as an exemplar, but rather as an example of how we approach things. So to my mind, one possibility that can be quickly excluded would be to venture into the area of funding the running costs of frontline clinical care. In other words, to try to do in 2024 what William Marsden and his friends endeavoured to do in the 1800s. Let me illustrate that in this way. The Wolfson Foundation has an endowment of just over £1 billion. If we wanted to use every single penny of those assets to run the health service, and if we decided to start at midnight 2025, New Year's Day, our funds would run out by 2:30 a.m. on the 3rd of January. So we would have just about scraped 48 hours. And the sheer cost of providing modern healthcare surely argues in favour of a national system. whether from tax or insurance. Philanthropy, even if it wanted to, cannot underwrite the immense costs of modern healthcare. Of course, some philanthropists do put funding into creating and sustaining healthcare systems in lesser resourced countries. Judy was kind enough to give glancing reference to mercy ships. Mercy ships provide safe surgery and training for African countries that have little healthcare infrastructure. But even here, I think there's a recognition that floating operating theatres off the coast of Africa and flying in surgeons and all the rest of the staff isn't sustainable long term. There is an aim to do ourselves out of a job. So while the straightforward running costs for clinical care may be beyond modern philanthropy, the patient experience in all its shapes and forms surely seems an eminently important and sensible target for charitable giving. And this is perhaps seen in its starkest form at the end of life, when mainstream healthcare seems to have little left to offer by way of treatment, at least. So we move on to another hero of the charity sector, Cicely Saunders, and palliative care in the UK. Since she set up St Christopher's Hospice in the late 1960s, has, to a certain extent at least, been provided by independent hospices, in themselves with a mixed model of funding from philanthropy of various sorts, earned income, and of course government funding too. One of their strengths is that they are relatively small, they have strong roots in local communities, they don't sit as part of large institutions with competing demands, they can focus on their patients and their families in a very flexible and holistic way. They draw in local communities, and those of us who have had any involvement with them tend to feel passionately about them. We visit, we volunteer, we run marathons for them, or at least I don't run marathons for them, but some people do. So hospices then are fascinating case studies for the strengths and the weaknesses of philanthropy. I've touched on some of the benefits, but it is also worth noting that there are contrasts between the levels of care that can be provided in the most affluent communities in the UK and other parts of the UK where local economies are struggling. And it's interesting when we see hospice proposals coming across the desk at the Wolfson Foundation, the ones in greatest need tend to map on exactly to the areas where local people have less resources. So we looked a little bit at patient experience, but I thought it might be helpful to talk about a couple of other areas that certainly from a Wolfson Foundation perspective we see as being the most fruitful areas for philanthropy. First, there is a long and noble tradition in philanthropy essentially as serving as the risk capital of society. In other words, a source of funding for trialling new possibilities, new avenues. And it seems to me that that becomes more important than ever in health systems that are increasingly complex or that are under increasing pressure. And so in this context, we might think of an organisation like the King's Fund, who themselves have gone through an interesting transformation that in a way helps to tell the story of philanthropy in healthcare. They were set up, as most of you will know, in the 1890s under the patronage of the then Prince of Wales, with the aim to support London's voluntary hospitals in that period before the National Health Service. But now, of course, it's essentially a health think tank. And we think of other organisations like the Health Foundation, with, in that case, a very different source of original wealth that came from a mutual health insurance scheme, but with a similar set of aims and ambitions spending their energy and their funding trialling innovative ideas for the health service. So, one area then is the trialling of new approaches within healthcare. But secondly, and this I think for the Wolfson Foundation has seemed to be the most fruitful area for our funds, is the area of basic medical research. And of course this is an immensely well-trodden path, of which Wellcome and Gates are merely the most prominent in a whole ecosystem of charities and philanthropy. An ecosystem that includes the UK's largest fundraising charity, Cancer Research UK. So just looking inward for a moment at the Wolfson Foundation, most of what we fund is infrastructure. That is the equipment, and of course it's increasingly expensive equipment, and buildings that underpin basic research, discovery research. It's an area that government, whether directly or through research councils or NIHR, tends not to prioritise, and nor is that basic infrastructure particularly a fruitful area for commercial investment. And of course, we don't have to go very far to see an eminent example of that in action here at the Royal Free, the Institute of Immunity and Transplantation in the Pears building. And it's very good to see Trevor Pears here tonight representing the Pears Foundation. So let me just press home what I suspect to this audience may not be entirely necessary, but let me press home in any case the importance of funding research through some case studies. Case studies, of course, are many and myriad because modern medicine is built on high quality research. But let me start with this example. Across the last 15 years or so, the Wolfson Foundation has had something of an interest in infectious diseases. Strange to say, but before the pandemic, this was a somewhat lonely area for philanthropic funding. So in partnership with the Royal Society, between 2015 and 2017, we funded many of the infectious diseases labs at leading centres around the UK. It meant that when COVID-19 struck, whatever other challenges there were, those particular labs went into the crisis with decent quality facilities. And some years earlier, we had contributed a substantial sum towards the construction of Oxford's Jenner Institute. And so when the Oxford vaccine emerged in those dark days of 2020, it was the result of the ingenuity, of course, of the researchers. It was a result of the partnership with AstraZeneca. But it was also the result of funding across many years from a variety of sources. From pharma, from government, and yes, also from philanthropy. And so in a way, this case study exemplifies the philosophy that we've tried to take over the years, backing the highest quality research wherever it is found, with something of an emphasis on discovery research, basic research. And as private funders, as charitable funders, we can do that in the full knowledge that we can be patient in looking for an impact that might be long-term, and also we can know that the more basic the research, the higher risk the research, the greater the possibility of failure. But let me just finish this section by giving a final example of discovery research. You will recognise from the slide the eminent figure of Peter Mansfield, who was a physics professor at Nottingham in the 1970s and was funded by the Wolfson Foundation, among others, for his basic research. It was work, of course, that at least partially led to the development of MRI and for which he won the Nobel Prize in 1993. So in summarising this section, you might, I suppose, expect me to draw neat and careful distinctions, using the example of MRI, between the responsibility of the state and the responsibility of philanthropy. And indeed, to a certain extent, that holds true. Much of the basic research, as I've mentioned, was funded through philanthropic grants, and the purchase and the running of MRI machines in UK hospitals, to a considerable extent now, is covered by the NHS. And industry has its own role to play in the construction and the distribution of those bits of kit. But I guess the example of MRI, like the earlier example of palliative care and hospices, shows that the funding model is always a little bit more complex than that. When the time came for the first wave of MRIs to be put into hospitals, that they were seen as pioneering bits of kit. There was a research element often involved, and they were funded in the 1980s predominantly through philanthropy. And if we fast forward to this year, for the very first time, the Gilbert Bain Hospital on the Shetland Isles installed an MRI scanner. It was the first because previously there had been no business case for one on the island. There wasn't a big enough population base, and therefore the islanders had to travel to the mainland for their scans. So how was the new scanner funded? It was funded through, as this news clip shows, it was funded through a public appeal. So let me recap before we move off from this first point. The relationship between philanthropy and the state. There is surely a vital role for philanthropy to play in healthcare. It can aid the patient experience, perhaps seen in its starkest form in hospices and palliative care. And it can support trialling imaginative new approaches, as with the King's Fund. But for the Wolfson Foundation, it has over many decades now meant backing the most intriguing and exciting areas of research, knowing that in the fullness of time, much of this will translate into benefits for patients. But the example of MRI shows that distinctions are not always neat, and there are and will remain murky and slightly muddy areas. So, much to unpack, much to unpick, and no doubt points to come back to in question and answer. But let me move on to my second overall theme, and that is the current scrutiny of philanthropy, the spotlight under which philanthropy increasingly is being placed. Philanthropy is needed more than ever. The challenges facing our society at this moment are huge. It was only last month that Gemma Peters, Chief Executive of healthcare charity Macmillan, said there are greater needs, greater inequity, more hardship, more challenging things being faced in the UK than I've seen in my lifetime. And this is an audience that doesn't need me to reinforce that in terms of the health service. An ageing population, more chronic diseases, rising incidence of mental health, huge challenges in social care. I could go on. I don't want to depress you. But when we turn to the world of medical research, the boundless opportunities being opened up by researchers are only matched by the ongoing struggle to attract the funds to support that research. But increasingly, that spotlight on philanthropy is a critical one. And we might well ask, why now? Why would philanthropy come under critique and criticism at this particular point? Well, I think it's probably part of a set of wider trends that we're seeing in society. In the years following the financial crash of 2008, public discussion around wealth and wealth generation took on a more negative tone. It sits alongside a more generalized distrust of elites, however you define elites. And of course, we have a deeply polarised politics on both sides of the Atlantic. The presidential election in the States is only a recent example of that, with philanthropy very often then getting caught in that crossfire. And that polarisation has included a renaissance of interest in heavy state intervention. So all of these trends were exacerbated by the COVID pandemic on the one hand and widening levels of inequality on the other. And if you add into the mix the growth of social media, we find that these voices become shriller and more insistent in the echo chamber online. So what are the critics saying? What is the critique of philanthropy? Well, we've just been considering this delicate balance between the role of the state and philanthropic funding within healthcare. And the critique of philanthropy generally starts here by pitting government funding against private giving. So in this context, state intervention is lauded as being large-scale, democratic, strategic. Philanthropy, on the other hand, is seen as small-scale, mercurial, self-interested. Philanthropy, it is argued, tinkers around the edges. It plays with seashore pebbles while the great ocean of need goes unmet. In January 2019, young Dutch author Ruchia Bremen took part in a panel discussion at Davos at the World Economic Forum. And this is what he said. He said, "Stop talking about stupid philanthropy schemes. We should be talking about taxes, taxes, taxes." Well, his comments weren't particularly insightful. Neither were they very novel. But what was unusual about what he said was the huge take-up that those comments had, particularly online, but also tipping over into mainstream media, sparking a lot of debate and discussion. And in a way, his comments symbolised a trend, really. That is, what was once more of an academic analysis, limited to a certain extent to academic circles, is tipping over into the mainstream. This includes Bremen's own book, Utopia for Realists, and there are many other examples that we could give, but let me just provide one, perhaps the best known. Stanford academic Rob Reich and his book, best-selling book, Just Giving: Why Philanthropy is Failing Democracy and How It Can Do Better. So in the book, Rob Reich argues that affluent donors and their so-called excess wealth are symptoms of an unjust economic system. They're not considered as part of the solution. He also goes on to argue that philanthropy gives the wealthy too much influence, particularly on political issues. So, as civic gratitude begins to give way to civic scrutiny, there are, or potentially there are, a number of practical implications. One is a call to remove tax relief on charitable donations. And in a more general sense, the source of wealth and the wider connections of a donor become ever more important to society. So in the case of an endowed foundation like the Wolfson Foundation, the nature of the asset management as well as the source of those underlying funds comes under scrutiny. Of course, the highest profile example of this scrutiny itself connects to the medical world. The Sackler family and their related foundations gained their wealth through the pharmaceutical industry. They gave widely across the medical as well as the cultural world, but sustained spotlight on and criticism of the family, their charities, and in particular their link to the opioid crisis has led to the pausing of donations and the removal of plaques, as shown in the slide. And there are many other examples. Just this year we could, in UK society, think of Baillie Gifford and their funding of book festivals. And we could also think about BP's large donation to the British Museum. Fundraising organisations are increasingly coming under pressure to reject funds. So in this context, critics very often also use philanthropy as a lightning rod to question the whole basis of wealth and wealth distribution in society. And the most striking recent example of this, you will recall, of course, was the toppling of the statue of Edward Colston in Bristol in 2020. The statue was erected in the late Victorian era by the citizens of Bristol, I quote from the plaque, as a memorial to one of the most virtuous and wise sons of our city. And indeed, Colston was a prominent member of Bristol society in the 17th and early 18th century, a well-known and generous philanthropist. But, and of course you wouldn't have gleaned this from the plaque, he was also heavily involved in the slave trade. And you will remember the sorry end of Colston, as shown in the picture. A group of demonstrators, outraged by his presence on the streets of Bristol, toppled the statue, defaced it, and threw it into Bristol Harbour. And actually, something else was thrown into Bristol Harbour alongside the statue, and that was the view in British society that the source of a donation is unimportant. A view that had been held on and off for a long period of time, which had increasingly come under scrutiny. We might argue finally died its death alongside Colston's statue. Of course, moral judgment is relatively easy when imposed on historic figures and their statues, whether Edward Colston in Bristol or in Oxford, the statue of Cecil Rhodes. But when the UK foundation, well-known foundation, Lankelly Chase, decided last year to close down and redistribute their assets, they argued, and again I'm quoting, the traditional philanthropy model is so entangled with colonial capitalism that it inevitably continues the harms of the past into the present. Well, that's just a brief overview of this trend and some of its manifestations, at least here in the UK. But really I'd like to conclude with some rather more upbeat thoughts on how we should respond, because the critique does raise the question for fundraisers and for givers alike of what we should do. And again, I will turn away from the abstract and come back to the example of the Wolfson Foundation. No doubt there will be different views in this room as to how justified the critique of philanthropy is, for what it's worth, and this may not surprise you. My view is that much of it is fundamentally unfair. But I think we also have to acknowledge that there can be a positive outcome from this spotlight on philanthropy. There can be a positive outcome from this critique. We do need, it seems to me, a public discussion about where society as a whole wants to draw the lines on receiving funds which are necessary to continue charitable work. Where do we draw that line? What is a tainted donation? And when the critique also leads to greater transparency, when it leads to higher standards in philanthropy, then I think we should welcome that. Certainly at the Wolfson Foundation, it's made us think carefully about how we can be as open as we possibly can be about the work that we support and the way we go about making decisions. And it's also made us think deeply about how we work genuinely in partnership with organisations that we fund. But in a world of scrutiny, in a world of gift acceptance committees, it also seems to us that actually it's increasingly important to make the case for philanthropy. We're just about to enter the Christmas period, and part of the story recounted each year, of course, is the account of the Magi, mysterious men from the East, bearing their gifts to the child Jesus. It's one of the earliest recorded acts of philanthropy, we might argue, and it's immortalised here in this rather wonderful mosaic from about the year 500, which you can still see in Ravenna. There they are carrying their gifts of gold, frankincense and myrrh. But of course in 2024 the Magi would be treated with great suspicion. Their source of wealth is offshore. It is from an unknown provenance. It, I suspect, would not get through the standard gift acceptance committee. And this is where I want to conclude. How do we harness and encourage the emotional drive, the generosity of spirit and action that led William Marsden to set up the Royal Free, that caused Isaac Wolfson to establish the Wolfson Foundation, and that propelled the wise men across the desert? How do we balance a reasonable need for scrutiny with the overwhelming needs of society? Philanthropy surely is crucial. And we need philanthropy not just for the funds that it can provide. It seems to me the state can never provide all of the answers to society's problems. The money on the margins then can have an oversized impact, and not least in medicine and in healthcare. Here in the UK, we actually live in a very generous society. 75% of people give to charity every year. We're often contrasted with the States, but actually in the States, only 85% of people give each year, so it's a very comparable number. But the difference in the States is that the wealthiest give the most generously. Here in the UK, the poorest 10% by income proportionately give the most. And all of the evidence seems to suggest that there are two factors above all that influence levels of giving in a society. First, your attitude towards government, the extent to which you anticipate that government will simply pick up the tab for whatever needs there are. And secondly, religion, and this actually cuts across almost all religions. So, since 1945, we've faced a challenge. On the one hand, society has become more secular. On the other hand, the role of the state has become greater. How then can we build a new ethic, an ethic that encourages greater levels of giving? I'll leave that question hanging. We'll perhaps come back to it in questions. But let me just finish on what I hope is a note of consensus. Our aim should be for a more generous, more giving, more philanthropic society. Scrutiny is important. At some level, we need these debates about what philanthropy is and how it can be improved. But surely what a disaster it would be if those very debates discouraged giving. So 2 centuries after William Marsden was so affected by that young woman on the steps of St. Andrews, let us redouble our efforts to create a generous society, and a generous society for the benefit of healthcare, and a generous society for the benefit of all of those suffering ill health. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul, for such an engaging, insightful, provocative talk. We talked beforehand about the fact that we like our speakers to make our audience think. I think you absolutely did that. We have an opportunity for the audience to ask questions now.
I think in terms of the research on what is the tipping point for the most affluent in society to give, I think a lot of it connects to circles of influence and peer pressure. And so if you're in a society or in a community where giving is normal and has been from a very young age, it just becomes a normal part of everyday life. And if you're not, it probably isn't on your radar. So I think to a considerable extent it's as straightforward as that. And I think the point I made about religion, it probably actually is less to do with belief and more to do with being part of a close-knit community where giving is embedded in the very psyche of the community. So I think that's one answer. I think, it is also fair to say that in America the tax regime is extremely different. And so, another way of looking at the contrast between the UK and the US is that if you put philanthropy and taxation together in the US, you probably have a similar or slightly lower amount than if you do the same thing over here in the UK. And the heavy burden of that, of course, falls on the most affluent in society. So that's another way of looking at it. High tech, well, there will be other people in the room who are much better at answering this than me. But I think potentially it does come back to this sense that one role for philanthropy is risk capital, de-risking, pioneering technologies, trialing them, using philanthropic money, taking the evidence to statutory sources of funding and thinking about how that might be scaled up. So, I think that is a well-trodden route, whether in high-tech or other pioneering areas within the healthcare system and elsewhere. But there will be other people in the room, no doubt, who will have a much better insight than me on that. Thank you. I think you're right. I guess it goes alongside a society that feels comfortable with giving and celebrates giving. I think, rightly or wrongly, the British model has tended to be rather reticent about wealth and wealth creation, and has been reticent about giving wealth away. It's followed more the model of not letting the left hand know what the right hand is doing. I think the challenge with that is exactly the point that you've put your finger on, that actually visible philanthropy is an encouragement. It's that subtle peer pressure, but also it's a visible reminder of the remarkable things that can be achieved with philanthropy. And so I think it's a well-made point. You can't move on an American campus without seeing a donor's name, it's fair to say. And whether we want to import that lock, stock and barrel here, I don't know, but certainly it would, I think, give greater visibility to philanthropy. The point on basic research, I think, is an interesting one. I hadn't really thought that, but I suspect you're right, that then in the US, as well as there just being more by way of philanthropic spend, it is perhaps targeted more towards basic rather than applied research. I don't know why that is. I can only repeat really what the point I made in the lecture, that I think for philanthropy, that long-term investment in discovery research does seem quite a rich area. Certainly if you're an endowed foundation, you have long-term investment horizons. You probably have got a greater appetite for risk and failure. So, for example, we put a little bit of funding in the 1960s into what looked quite a speculative area of research, into kind of laser research. And of course, it wasn't until a couple of decades later that it had its first health application, and now laser technology used widely across the health service. So there may be other people in the room who know a little bit more about the dynamics of the states and precisely why there would be more philanthropic money going in earlier into more basic research. But I think it's a very interesting point. Thank you. The issue of measuring outcomes is a huge debate within philanthropy. And there are whole careers won and lost on how you go about measuring outcomes. And I think, unfortunately, what tends to happen is that philanthropic donors tend to place the onus on the organisations raising the funds. And of course, it's easier in some areas than others. It partly depends on exactly what you're trying to do with the funding. At the Wolfson Foundation, we have a philosophy, particularly in terms of research, of being relatively light touch. You know, we're very rigorous up front in trying to identify, through peer review, the brightest and the best and the most promising. To some extent, once you've invested the money, impact measurement will tell you perhaps how good your peer review was, but you're not going to take the money back. So we've tended to do a relatively high level, with exceptions, relatively high level monitoring and evaluation. There are other foundations who have created whole machineries and mechanisms to measure particularly kind of how you shift the dial on social issues. And so it partly also comes back to what you're aiming to do as a philanthropist. I mean, if you're simply trying to put up a piece of research infrastructure that will support quality research over a generation, well, there are ways of measuring that, you know, research outcomes like papers published and so on. If, on the other hand, you're trying to do something a bit more sophisticated and, you know, reduce the levels of homelessness on the streets of London, suddenly you're into a very complex set of calculations about the extent to which your particular chunk of the pie in your funding had an influence on that or not. Does philanthropy let government off the hook? I think not, actually. And I do feel that in most areas of public provision, there is a sort of tacit agreement as to where the lines lie, whether in schools or in hospitals or in other areas, that, you know, the fundamental running costs of essential public provision is a government responsibility, whatever form that comes through. And the added extras, some of the things that we've been talking about tonight, are the proper responsibility of philanthropy. And certainly in the UK, I think probably the philanthropic sector is not large enough, actually, yet, to let the government off the hook. Certainly if you think about kind of mainstream education and health provision, which are the areas that I know most about. But I don't know whether that chimes with your thinking.
I think that's all we've got time for. Please join me, ladies and gentlemen, in showing your appreciation for Paul Ramsbottom. I'm going to step slightly out of the way of that blinding light. It wouldn't be an evening talking about philanthropy without us talking about philanthropy. So I want to take the opportunity to describe to you all some areas of focus for the Royal Free Charity at the moment. As many of you will know, whether you're colleagues of ours in the Trust, whether you're supporters of the charity, or whether you're other friends of both charity and Trust, we have a shared ambition for cancer services in North London. We recognise the scale of the cancer challenge that we face here and across the country, and we desperately need to improve our ability to improve outcomes through earlier diagnosis and fastest access to the latest treatments. And as we've described in Paul's lecture, the patient experience is obviously a really fundamental part of what philanthropy can achieve. Thanks to the generosity of our donors, several of whom are in the room this evening, we've already bought one of the best scanners in the world, which is here in the Royal Free Hospital. And right now, we are working on securing funding to bring in a new robot for our surgical teams who operate on some of the body's most aggressive cancers, including those of the liver, the pancreas, and the digestive tract. And longer term, we have a goal to create a new dedicated cancer centre for North London right here at the Royal Free Hospital. There is some more information in the leaflets on your seats about our surgical robot appeal, and hopefully very soon we'll also be able to share with you more information about the cancer centre that I referred to. Please do read the material that we've provided for you, and if you would like to talk to any of my colleagues or me at the charity, we'd be delighted to have that conversation. That brings tonight's event to a close. I hope you enjoyed it. There are an awful lot of people to thank. This is an incredibly complicated event to put on, so I'm not going to single anyone out, but I would like to say an enormous thank you to my team from the charity and to the many colleagues from the Trust who've made this possible, and to our teams, catering, video, and others who've made this work. Thank you very much indeed. Good night, and see you again next year.